Sir, are the slides visible, sir?
Yeah, to me it's visible. Yeah.
A very good evening to one and all. Hope all of us are safe in these difficult times. I am Dr. Ajay Hanumantu. I am the third year PDT at the Department of Endocrinology in NRSMCH. On behalf of the Endocrine Society of Bengal, I welcome you all to this 4A webinar. The topic of today's webinar is craniopharyngioma. Now, before we go ahead with the session, I would like to inform you all regarding the World Thyroid Day webinar 2021, which is scheduled to be held on 25th of May 2021, which is organized by the Endocrine Society of Bengal. I request all of you to register for this webinar using the link provided in the chat box. Now, moving on to today's webinar, we have with us an eminent endocrinologist, Professor Sambit Das, who's run his DM endocrinology from the prestigious PGI Chandigarh. Sir is the Professor of Endocrinology at High Tech Medical College, Bhubaneswar. Sir is the Senior Consultant Endocrinologist at Endeavour Clinic and Apollo Sugar Clinic, Bhubaneswar. Sir has many publications in international and national journals. He has written several abstracts and book chapters as well. Sir is the principal investigator in several phase 3 clinical trials. He is the secretary of the Endocrine Society of Odisha. Sir was the scientific secretary at ESICON 2018. Sir is the secretary of AIARO at Odisha chapter. Sir is a member of Endocrine Society of India. Thank you, sir, so much for joining us and agreeing to be the chairperson for today's session. And to deliver today's talk, we have Dr. Riaz Ares. He is currently the assistant professor in the Department of Endocrinology at Government Medical College, Trivandrum. He is also affiliated with Indian Institute of Diabetes, Trivandrum. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today and agreeing to deliver this. I would request Professor Sambit Das, sir, to please take over the session.
Yeah, thank you, thank you, Doctor. So, a very good evening, one and all. And at the outset, I must thank Nilanjan sir and the members of Endocrine Society of Bengal for giving this opportunity. And and the topic is quite interesting today. And if you ask any of the non-endocrine colleagues, then they will actually think why are we discussing craniopharyngioma in an endocrine program. But in fact, it's a very important topic, and we all know that pre-op, intra, post-op, what all hormonal imbalances can happen, and even for during the long-term follow-up. I think to highlight on that, we have a wonderful speaker today. Dr. Riaz is from Kerala. He's the Assistant Professor, Department of Endocrinology, Government Medical College, Trivandrum. So without wasting much time, I'll ask Dr. Riaz to please share his slides and start the topic.
Thank you, Ajay, and thank you, Sambit sir, for the kind introduction. So let me start sharing my slides. So is it visible, my slides?
No. Not yet, not yet.
Not yet. Ajay, maybe you can help him.
Riaz, are you seeing share screen option, the green color button?
Yes.
When you click on that, have you minimized your presentation on the desktop?
Yes, but I couldn't get that presentation. Just a second. Now is it visible?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just put on the presenter view.
Slideshow.
Now is it okay?
Okay.
Let's see. So good evening, everyone. So at the outset, I thank Endocrine Society of West Bengal and my teacher, Professor Nilanjan Sen Gupta sir, for giving me this opportunity to talk on this topic. So today we will be discussing about the craniopharyngioma. So my plan of presentation for today is like this. First is introduction, giving a short history, then epidemiology, then pathology and pathogenesis, and how this kind of patients present to us, and how we will diagnose, including the imaging studies and the different modes of treatment. So this World Health Organization defined craniopharyngioma as a benign, partially cystic epithelial tumor of the cellular region, presumably derived from the Rattle's pouch epithelium. So this is a rare rare benign tumor. It is derived from the embryonic malformations of the cellular and paracellular area, which is a low histological grade. It is derived from the remnants of Rattle's pouch along a line from the nasopharynx to the diencephalon. It is situated very close to the very important structures in the brain like optic nerve, optic chiasma, and hypothalamic and pituitary axis. And it is, even though we call it as a benign tumor, it has a very important property that it is very adherent tumor and it can infiltrate the adjacent structures like the pituitary, hypothalamus, optic nerves, blood vessels, and third ventricles. So it has its implications in the clinical management also. And even after a seemingly complete resection, these tumors can recur, and or if after a partial resection, there can be chances of progression, and the quality of life is impaired in survivors due to the long-term sequelae of these tumors. So, a short history of this craniopharyngioma. In 1857, Sanger first identified masses of cells resembling squamous epithelium in the pituitary. And later, the Austrian pathologist Erdheim described cysts with squamous epithelial cells in the adenohypophysis, and he named it as hypophyseal duct neoplasms. And later, von Michailov, which put forward this theory that developing adenohypophysis underwent a forward and upward rotation. And later, Sussman also identified these epithelial cells in children. And Lewis in 1982 first attempted the surgical removal of this kind of tumor. This is a description of craniopharyngioma by Harvey Cushing. He actually coined the term craniopharyngioma. So this is a history of. So this is a autopsy section of this patient where he operated on the tumor, which showed that this patient had this visual field involvement as well as this is the autopsy section showing the craniopharyngioma. He also named that this is a grave intracranial tumor, this craniopharyngioma. Coming to the epidemiology, the incidence is around 0.5 to 2.5 cases per million persons per year globally. It is around 1.2 to consist of around 1.2 to 4.6% which are all intracranial tumors. This tumor is found to be more common, more frequent in Japan. So frequency is little higher than the rest of the world. Of all craniopharyngiomas, around 30 to 50% are diagnosed during childhood and adolescence. And see, craniopharyngiomas are the most common non-neuroepithelial intracerebral neoplasms in children, which comprises around 5 to 11% of tumors. It can be detected at any age, even in fetal, and the reports are there in the fetal and neonatal period. There is no difference in male to female ratio. It's almost similar in most of the case reports. There are no known risk factors for the development of this tumor, and there are no genetic risk factors, and familial inheritance is not described. So this is a descriptive epidemiology of craniopharyngioma from the Central Brain Tumor Registry of the US. In this frequency chart, you can see that the maximum frequency is seen in the age group of 5 to 14 years, and later in the adult age group 50 to 74 years, there is a similar increase can be seen. So in this brain tumor registry, this is almost the male and female ratio is almost equal in both of these epidemiology studies. So this is something a little about the embryology. So we all know that the pituitary has two different parts, an anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary, and developing from two different parts. This anterior pituitary is developing from the roof of the mouth, which is the stomodium, and posterior pituitary is developing from the diencephalon. So this is a upward invagination of this roof of the mouth, and this is called the Radke's pouch, and this is first the pouch, and its process starts during the fourth week of embryological life, and later these two united and forms the pituitary. So during this process of development, this Radke's pouch usually gets obliterated and disintegrates and form the final pituitary. But in some cases, the remnants of this pouch can remain and lead to the development of pathologies like keratis, clusters, and craniopharyngiomas. So coming to the location, this can arise anywhere along the craniopharyngeal canal from the sphenoid sinus to the hypothalamus area, but most of them in the cellular paracellular area. We have described the embryology is developing from the oral cavity to the diencephalon. So this the dashed line shows the pathway of the development of this craniopharyngium, and it can develop anywhere along this line. So most of the craniopharyngiomas are located in the suprasellar area, and purely suprasellar is seen in around 20%, and 5% are purely intrasellar, and rest of them are seen in both the locations. And even though it is located in the suprasellar area, it can extend to the other areas. It can extend anteriorly to the prechiasmatic system covering the optic chiasma and visual apparatus. It can extend posteriorly to the interpedunculaar system, floor of the third ventricle, and even compress the brainstem. And it can also into the temporal fossa and the middle fossa also. Rarely, these tumors can be present in ectopic sites like nasopharynx, paranasal areas, sphenoid bone, pineal gland, posterior cranial fossa, and cerebellopontine angles. So coming to the pathology, pathologically the craniopharyngioma can be divided into two types: Adamantinomatous and papillary. Adamantinomatous craniopharyngioma is the most common type. It has a bimodal peak of age distribution, one at the 5 and 15 years, and the next at the 45 and 60 years. This papillary craniopharyngioma is mostly exclusively occurs in adults, and the age of presentation is around 40 and 55 years, and it comprises around 14 to 50% of the tumors in this age group. So this is coming to the histological section of the adamantinomatous type of craniopharyngioma. It's a complex lesion. So it consists of these forms epithelial disposed present in the forms of pods, nodules, and irregular trabeculia, which are bordered by palisadal columnar epithelium in a picket fencing manner. And there are also loosely arranged epithelial cells which are called stellate reticulum. And there is characteristic presence of wet keratin, which are remnants of pale nuclei embedded within the eosinophilic keratinous mass. And there are cystic cavities can be seen containing squamous cell debris lined by flattened epithelium. And the area where this tumor shares with the normal bone structure, there are reactive gliotic changes can be seen, which is seen as eosinophilic abundant dorsal fibers at the interface of this tumors. This is a histopathological section showing this arrangement of this epithelium. This is a palisading arrangement or picket fencing arrangement of this squamous epithelium bordering the tumor. And this is the loosely arranged epithelium showing the stellate pattern. And this is the calcification seen in the HND staining. And this is the interface area which share with the brain area showing the reactive gliotic changes of this tumor. So coming to papillary type, it's a monomorphous mass of well-differentiated squamous epithelium. But here there are no picket fencing like arrangement or palisading arrangement of the bordered epithelium. There are no wet keratin pearls can be seen in papillary arrangement, and there are no calcification seen. So this is a comparison between the two types of different types of craniopharyngioma. In the adamantinomatous craniopharyngioma, we can see the palisading arrangement, the stellate reticulum, the wet keratin pearls, and the gliotic changes. And this is the immunohistochemical staining showing abundance of the beta-catenin mutation, which is a characteristic feature of this adamantinomatous craniopharyngioma. While papillary craniopharyngioma, there are fibrovascular cords surrounded by epithelium, but there are no palisading or picket fencing arrangement, no wet keratin pearls or calcifications are seen. But in this tumor, this is the immunohistochemically showing highly positive for BRAF mutations. So adamantinomatous craniopharyngioma harbor mutations in the CTNNB1 gene, which codes for the beta-catenin. This beta-catenin is either beta-catenin WNT pathway, which activates the intracellular pathway, which has various roles during the development. And so this tumor There's many roles in the cell fate, cell development, cell movement, and polarity of the developing cells. What happens is during these mutations, the beta catenin stability is increased, and this remain and increase causes the proliferation of this epithelial cells. It's mainly caused by the point mutations in the exon 3 of this gene, and cause absent degradation of the beta catenin by the bicrinus pathway, which causes accumulation and leading to the proliferations. So mutations of the genes of CTNN B1 and adenomatous polyposis coli are an exclusive characteristic of this adamantinomatous type of cranioparenchyma. Formation of cysts and their size can be related to the expression of carbonic anhydrase 9. While papillary cranioparenchyma shows a different mutation, it shows mutations of BRAF V600D, which is leading to the activation of mitogen activated protein kinase signaling pathway, which causes the proliferation of cells. In some studies, it has shown that there are chromosomal abnormalities in 2 and 12, but it's only in 1 or 2 studies. So coming to the pathogenesis of this cranioparenchyma, 2 theories are put forward for the development of this cranioparenchyma. One is embryonic theory and the other is a metaplastic theory. The embryonic theory is saying that it is the cranioparenchyma is originating from the ectodermal remnants of the Radke's pouch. While in metaplastic theory, it is the cranioparenchyma is developing from the epithelium that is later transforming by metaplasia into the tumor cells. So adamantomatous cranioparenchyma is mainly pathogenesis is mainly embryonic in origin. So it arises from the neoplastic transformation of embryonic squamous cell nest of cranioparengeal duct, and it causes proliferation and rotation of the cells of this Radke's pouch, and the cell remnants can spread through the intracellular and supracellular region, and this rotation of the adenohypophysis resulting in a spread of cells to the other areas like supracellular area, which is the most common location. Since rarely in some locations it can also move to the other areas like CP angle, cerebellopodian angle. It is commonly associated with Gardner syndrome of APC. In papillary cranioparenchymas, it is the main theory behind this is the metaplastic theory. This metaplasia of the adenohypophyseal cells in the pars tuberalis of the adenohypophysis result in the squamous cell nest. And this theory is supported by the presence of metaplastic cells in the pituitary gland. So this is a mouse model developed in the pathogenesis of adenomatous cranioparenchyma. So this is an inducible in the mouse embryonic pituitary stem cells. They induced the beta catenin gene mutation with cells which have SOX2 transcription factor. And after few divisions, after few proliferation, this proliferation stops temporarily, and this form a cluster of cells called senescent cells cluster. And these senescent cluster has the ability to secrete various factors like growth factors, inflammatory markers, and it causes the initiation of tumor development in the mouse. So this is called the senescent associated secretory phenotype. The same theory has been found to be present in the human adamantinomatous cranioparenchyma also. So how these cranioparenchyma usually present to physicians? Usually this in children and adults there's a little difference in the presentation. Usually in children this diagnosis is little delayed because often they present with some non-specific manifestations of intracranial pressure like headache and nausea. Usually the primary manifestations are visual impairment like visual decrease in visual acuity or visual field defects, and endocrine, and also can present with endocrine deficits in around 52 to 87% of the time. The hormonal deficits at the time of diagnosis are more in case of adults, but in children also the hormonal deficits can be present. The most common hormonal involvement is the growth hormone, which is found in almost 75% of the children. And second is the gonadotropin deficiency. Sometimes these patients can present as delayed puberty. And ACTH and TSH deficiencies are found in around 1/4 of the cases. Along with the anterior pituitary deficiency, these child can also present with posterior pituitary deficiency in the form of polyuria and polydipsia. So at the time of diagnosis, around 40 to 87% of the patients can present with at least one hormonal deficit in endocrine manifestation, and compression of the pituitary stalk can cause diabetes insipidus in around 70 to 38% of the cases. And pathologically reduced growth rate, which is an early manifestation of the disease, can present in even in children as young as 12 months of age. And hypothalamic involvement may cause significant weight gain, which is usually a late feature in the comparing to the other endocrine involvement. So the neurological symptoms, headache is an usual symptom presenting as presenting in craniopharyngioma. This can be due to raised intracranial pressure due to the tumor mass itself. Sometimes in children, this can obstruct the flow of CSF and can obstruct the foramen of Monro and can lead to obstructive hydrocephalus. And sometimes the content of the cyst can leak out, and it can irritate the meninges and cause meningitis. And while this tumor has a peculiarity of expanding into the surrounding structures, they can infiltrate the cavernous sinus and the cranial nerves present over there, and can cause diplopia and ocular muscle paralysis. And it can also impinge the temporal lobe and can cause seizure, can present a seizure, especially in the elderly age group. And large tumors may cause deteriorating cognitive abilities and personality changes also. So this is presenting pictures of craniopharyngioma in children. The usual manifestations are the headache, visual impairment, growth retardation, and impairment in consciousness, diabetes insipidus, and weight gain. But in adults, it is little different. They can usually present with some endocrine manifestation, usually hypogonadism, like impotence in a male and menstrual irregularity or amenorrhea in a female. And the symptoms related to intracranial pressure like headache, nausea, vomiting can also be a presenting feature. They can also present with hypothalamic symptoms like obesity or other behavioral changes. And visual impairment is also an important presenting feature. So how will we work up these patients with craniopharyngioma? So just like any other case, the first we will begin with a proper history and a good physical examination. So in the physical examination, a few things we have to be keep in mind. One is the anthropometry, that is height, weight, and obesity in percentage. The height, sometimes the patient don't have a short stature, but if they look at the height velocity, there is a decrease in the height velocity. And also, if we look at the chart, growth chart, we can see that there is a trend in falling from the growth percentage. You can cross the growth percentage in the growth chart. So this is all indicate that an acute cause of growth hormone deficiency is there. In these cases, we should be very careful regarding this acute cause of growth hormone deficiency like craniopharyngioma. The next is the sexual maturity rating. We have to evaluate the sexual maturity rating in testicular volume in males, because these cases can also present us in some delayed cases of delayed puberty. And the next is the central nervous system examination, especially the cranial nerves, some cranial nerves. So this can, because of this peculiar location, it can affect this cranial nerves 3, 4, 6, and 6 and go. So it can present as a visual acuity. Should be checked the visual field by confirmation method, and a formal perimetry should be done for the proper evaluation. And the laboratory test. So other than the routine blood examinations, all the anterior pituitary hormonal evaluation should be done, such as IGF-1, prolactin, ACTH, cortisol, for central hypothyroidism like TSH, 3, T4, LH, FSH, testosterone, and estradiol, and serum electrolytes. Sometimes these patients can have hyponatremia, maybe due to the associated hypothyroidism or due to the cortisol deficiency. And also in cases of patients with polyuria and polydipsia, serum osmolality and urine osmolality should be checked. Then should we go for the imaging. CT and MRI are the imaging choices. So first, with clinical suspicion, what are the things we should be? Suppose a patient with raised intracranial features like nausea and vomiting, or some visual abnormalities, some defects in the visual field, as a features of some endocrine deficiency, and how polyuria and polydipsia, craniopharyngioma should come first in the differential diagnosis. And radiological findings characteristic of this like cystic and solid part along with calcification, and visual field and visual acuity assessment showing that bitemporal hemianopia, and endocrine evaluation showing that there's a deficiency in the anterior pituitary hormones. These are all suggestive of diagnosis of craniopharyngioma. And histology is the gold standard for confirming the diagnosis. So coming to the imaging, CT and MRI are the usual modalities of the imaging. Even both with and without contrast enhancement, we did the imaging. For the detection of the calcification or to exclude calcification, CT is still considered the gold standard investigation. So MRI is done for the proper delineation of the tumor, the size of the tumor, the extent of the tumor, and its association with the important neighboring structures. So MRI before and after gadolinium is considered as the standard imaging for detection of craniopharyngioma. And a combination of solid, cystic, and calcified tumor components is an important radiological clue for this diagnosis of craniopharyngioma. Hydrocephalus occurs less frequently in adults compared to the children. So this is a rule of 90 in imaging of the adamantomatous type of craniopharyngioma, which means that almost 90% of the time there will be presence of cyst, and 90% of the time it shows calcifications, and 90% of enhancement of the cyst work. While popular type of craniopharyngiomas are more frequently non-calcified and solid in consistency. So imagine features of this adamantomatous craniopharyngioma. CT cyst is this adamantomatous craniopharyngioma mostly cystic. 90% of the time cyst can be present. Its near density is similar to the CSF, typically large and a dominant feature. And solid components show soft tissue density and is enhanced with the contrast in 90% of the cases. And we can see calcification in almost 90% of the cases is typically stippled and located around the periphery of the tumor. And coming to the MRI, so the intensity is quite varying. It can vary from iso, hypo to hyperintensity depending upon the protein concentration of the cystic fluid. So T1 iso to hyperintense to brain can be seen due to the protein content. T2 is variable, but 80% of the time, most of the time, it is partly hyperintense. The solid component is also iso-intense, but it shows vivid enhancement with the gadolinium contrast. In T2 intensity, it is variable or mixed intensity can be seen. So calcification, it's unlike CT, it is very difficult to appreciate on MRI or different sequences needed for the appreciation of calcification. Only susceptible weighted image may better demonstrate calcification. Even susceptible images are difficult if they are due to the presence of air in the sinuses. So this is the adamantomatous craniopharyngioma. This is the cystic part, and this is the solid part in the T1 coronal image. And it is slightly hyperintense compared to the CSF or the cystic fluid, and it is in showing variable intensity. This is T2 coronal image showing hyperintensity of the cystic area. So this is a T1 contrast clearly showing that this is an enhancement of the solid part, and also there is enhancement of the cyst one. So this is a CT scan of the papillary and adamantomatous type. Papillary type, there is a solid tumor. It's almost iso-intense, and there are no presence of calcification or cyst. But in adamantomatous craniopharyngioma, the cyst can be seen, and the peripheral rim of calcification, stippled calcification, can also be seen in the CT images. So papillary type cysts are usually not seen in papillary images. Solid components of tissues density, and it is also enhanced with enhancement with the contrast. Calcification is uncommon and rare in papillary type of craniopharyngioma. MRI cyst, when present, they are variable in signal. T1 can show 85% can show hypointensity. Solid component, it is iso to slightly hypointense to brain, and it also shows vivid enhancement with the gadolinium contrast, and variable or mixed intensity can be seen in T2 intensity. So coming to the papillary type of craniopharyngioma, this is showing varying intensity in T1 images and showing T1 and T2 images, but it is also showing a vivid enhancement with the contrasting T1 images. These are the 7 fundamental things to look for in the MRI of these patients. This is extent of third ventricle occupation by the tumor, degree of pituitary stud distortion, position of hypothalamus in relation to tumor, extent of chiasmatic system occupation, mammillary body angle, type of chiasm distortion, and tumor shape. So these things we looked into because this has implications in the management when we planning for surgery or the subsequent therapies. So preoperatively, we can grade the tumor involvement into 3 grades. That is grade 0, in which case the tumor has no hypothalamus involvement, and most tumors occupy in subdiaphragmatic space. While grade 1 tumors pushes or compress the hypothalamus, and the lesion has developed at the level because lesion has developed at the level of the infundibulum or pituitary stud and extended in the cellular trachea or developed entirely in the third ventricle. While grade 2, the hypothalamic structures cannot be clearly identified due to inversion of the tumor. Like this, the hypothalamus cannot be seen properly in these grade 2 lesions. So other than that, there are some lesions can present in the suprasellar area which can confuse with the craniopharyngioma diagnosis. The usual DDs are the Rathke's club cyst, pituitary adenomas, optic and hypothalamic gliomas, meningiomas, germinomas, and metastasis. So this is a low-grade glioma. The important feature of differentiating is low-grade glioma usually it is seen in younger age group, less than 5 years of age. And this is a high key to hyperintensity is a hallmark feature of this low-grade glioma. In CT, usually they appear as hypodense or isodense. Then coming to the germ cell tumors can be either secretory or non-secretory. Non-secretory are usually solid in consistency, but secretory can be seen similar to the craniopharyngioma with an irregular internal structure and small cyst. And usually the pituitary bright spot is absent in this germ cell tumor. And this here you can see the pituitary separate from this tumor. So another important differential diagnosis is Rathke's club cyst. It is also present in the cellular suprasellar area. It's mostly cystic lesion. But the differentiating features from craniopharyngiomas are it is usually monocystic and the walls are thin compared to the craniopharyngioma. The other important disease are pituitary adenoma, but the age group is slightly different. The pituitary adenoma, we can't see the pituitary as a different structure from this suprasellar structure. So it is also a differential, and it has also different post-contrast hyperintensity compared to the other tumors. So coming to the treatment of this craniopharyngioma, there is no evidence-based guidelines or a clear consensus for the best treatment of primary or recurrent craniopharyngioma in adults. So there are two approaches. One is the gross total resection or the radical approach, where we try to remove the maximum volume of the 90% of the tumor. And it's a conservative approach. We just remove a part of the tumor and do some adjuvant therapy like radiotherapy. And endocrine and metabolic complications should be treated prior to any tumor-directed therapy. If the patient has any hypothyroidism or if the patient has adrenal insufficiency, we should be treated prior to the therapy. And ideally, the treatment of craniopharyngioma should be at a higher center with a multidisciplinary team consisting of a neurosurgeon and a radiation oncologist, radiologist, and an endocrinologist. So these are the treatment strategies available for this craniopharyngioma. One is neurosurgery. It can be either transcranial approach or transsphenoidal approach. Then is the irradiation, can be either conventional radiotherapy or stereotactic radiotherapy, radial surgery, or newer modalities like proton beam therapy, and or you can try intracavitary beta irradiation, or the sclerosing therapy, and the newer targeted therapy based on the molecular pathology. So surgery is usually considered as the first line approach for the treatment of craniopharyngioma. Gross total, if it is favorably located in the site or like in infradiaphragmatic in location, gross total resection is the goal of the initial therapy. And aggressive surgery has peri and post-op morbidity, especially tumors invading the hypothalamus. Subtotal or partial resection of the tumor with or without subsequent radiotherapy is another option. And extended transsphenoidal endoscopic intranasal approach is focused primarily on the preservation of the hypothalamus and the visual integrity and preservation of the quality of life after this treatment. So transcranial approach is usually considered in tumors, very large tumors with very suprasellar extension. So classically, TDNL or subfrontal route are the preferred method. In these tumors, cysts can be opened for removal of the cyst wall and solid parts, and we can decompress the tumor. Large tumors within the ventricle, it can be approached by ventricular route through a lateral method. The transsphenoidal approach is a choice of treatment in intradiaphragmatic craniopharyngiomas with stellar enlargement. The advantages of this approach is that there is improved avoidance of can avoid craniotomy and neurovascular manipulations, and also the endocrine deficiencies are less compared to the transcranial approach. So just before we have seen that we have graded the hypothalamus involvement by the preoperative MRI. So if it is a grade 0 involvement, that is no hypothalamic involvement, extended transsphenoidal endoscopic intranasal approach is ideal in these cases of tumor, and it is most commonly used in adults. In grade 1, that is the tumor pushes or cumbers the hypothalamus a little. In these cases, gross total resection can be performed very carefully, and transcranial route has been used traditionally. Endoscopic intranasal approach used if lesion is subdiaphragmatic. In grade 2 tumor, that is means hypothalamic structures cannot be clearly identified. It is the most common presentation, 40 to 70%. Transcranial approach is used with subtotal resection can be considered in grade 2 tumors. So this is an CT post-operative CT image of a patient with craniopharyngioma. So usually we do MRI after for the post-operative evaluation of craniopharyngioma. But in some cases where we have doubt that there is some residual tumor even after a surgery and not picked up in MRI, we can do CT for the identification of calcification. This type of imaging was done in craniopharyngium study to find out the post-operative calcification to avoid the small residual tumors. So the next mode of therapy is radiotherapy. So it is considered where in cases where surgery is contraindicated, in cases of residual tumor tissue after subtotal or partial surgical resection, and in recurrent disease. So various types of radiotherapy has been used for the treatment, such as stereotactic fractional radiotherapy, radiosurgery, intensity modulated radiation therapy, and proton beam therapy. The radiation dose is given around 54 and 55 gray, but usually less than 61 gray. In one study, it was shown that if we give 54 gray of radiotherapy, the chances of recurrence are less. So the conventional external radiotherapy uses X-rays from multiple directions to confirm the dose to the target volume, sparing the non-target tissue which receives some collateral dose. So the conventionally used dose is 54 gray. It has been used to establish the worldwide, and it's an excellent long-term outcome in many retrospective studies. While the newer proton beam therapy, it is a dose related by the particle, dose reached by the particle increases with the penetration depth until it reaches a maximum at the end of the range. In conventional radiotherapy, there is the radiation goes in and can affect the tissue as well as tumor tissue as well as the surrounding tissue. The advantage of proton beam therapy is that it causes less radiation till it reaches the tumor site, and once it exits out of the tumor site, there is no radiation. So it is maximum radiation occurs at the area of the tumor. So this is called the Bragg peak effect. So dose to the non-target tissue is very minimal in case of proton beam therapy. So the advantages are better conformation to the target volume, sparing of critical structures, reduced integral dose, low dose of secondary malignancy. So these can be tried in very young children when we have to give radiation therapy. So coming to the stereotactic radiotherapy, it is a modality combining the accurate focal dose of delivery of stereotactic radiosurgery with radiobulging advantage of fractionation. In fractions, we can give stereotactic radiotherapy. So the reduced safety margins and offer optimal sparing of the normal tissue is an advantage of this therapy. So usually we consider a few millimeters more to remove the tumor. So that margin is less compared into the conventional radiotherapy when we use the stereotactic radiotherapy. The median target dose reported was 52.2 gray with conventional fractionation, and the adverse effects are impaired pituitary function, radionecrosis, or second malignancies. So radiosurgery is the most frequently used system for delivery is the gamma knife. Here we are giving the full dose in one setting, but we have to use a immobilizer which is a stereotactic fixed frame, delivering the treatment in single session. It is usually ideal for small tumors which are less than 3 centimeters, which are solid and well circumscribed lesions, and is usually more than 3 millimeters away from the critical structure like optic chiasm. So these are the post-operative radiotherapy, this overall survival and progression-free survival after craniopharyngioma therapy. It has shown that after 10 years, both progression-free survival and overall survival are around 80% in most of the series. These are the advantages and disadvantages of the different radiation modalities. Conventional 2D therapy has reliable clinical data and has long-term follow-up data indicating high efficacy. And the disadvantages are poor geometrical precisions and no reliable protection of normal surrounding tissue. In fractionated conformal radiation therapy, it's an excellent adjustment for treatment portals for tumor sites in 3D planning, can spare the normal tissues, but it needs rigid head fixation and low patient numbers. While proton beam therapy has advantages of Bragg peak effect with minimal exit dose effect to the normal tissue, but the data is limited with the proton beam therapy. So other modes of therapies are the intracavitary beta irradiations. So it involves the stereotactically guided installation of beta emitting isotopes into the cystic cavities. The usually used isotopes are this yttrium, phosphorus, gold, and rhenium. The yttrium is most commonly used. It is commonly used for the cystic type of craniopharyngiomas. So what is the cyst? It causes a destruction of the epithelial lining of the cyst and causes a shrinkage of the cyst. So yttrium is the commonly used because it has the shortest half-life and maximum energy it can produce. But it has an disadvantage that it can penetrate the surrounding tissues and it can cause critical damage to the critical structures near to the cyst. So it is usually considered in the monocystic varieties of craniopharyngioma or in post-operative recurrences with the cyst formation. And often it is oftenly given with after percutaneous irradiation. So we have to be careful, and before giving this kind of radiation, we have to rule out the any leakage of cyst is present. So other than this this intracystic beta irradiation of these substances, we can give some sclerosing substances installed into the tumor, into the cystic cavities of this tumor. It is also used in the cystic varieties and also in cases of recurrent cystic craniopharyngium. The usually used two modes are bleomycin and interferon alpha. So, but bleomycin is now not commonly used because of irreversible neurological side effects. And it can, if it is also leaked in by chance, it is leaked in the CSF, it can cause meningitis and other serious side effects. So, interferon alpha is an option for in these cases for predominantly monocystic craniopharyngiomas. Cystic craniopharyngioma, so systemic chemotherapy is generally not regarded as effective in treatment of craniopharyngiomas. So these are the newer therapies for the management of craniopharyngiomas in the pipeline. So we have described that the papillary type of craniopharyngioma is due to the mutation of the BRAF V600D mutation. So there are two drugs which can cause the inhibition of this BRAF. These are the dabrafenib and vemurafenib, and also MEK inhibitors, trametinib and cobimetinib. These are the newer medical therapies for the management of this craniopharyngioma, especially papillary type of craniopharyngioma. So recurrence, there are chances of recurrence for this craniopharyngioma. Highest for the, after surgery, and highest in the first initial 3 years, and then tends to reach a plateau. After gross total resection, the risk of tumor recurrence has been reported between 0 and 26%. And subtotal resection without any radiotherapy has highest risk of relapse with around 35 to 100% chance of recurrence. With the radiotherapy alone, there is a chance of recurrence of around 23%. And if you give subtotal resection and radiotherapy, the chances are similar to gross total resection. So how we will deal with the recurrent disease? So surgical treatment after a recurrence is difficult because anatomical landmarks may have distorted after a first surgery, and there can be scarring of the tissue after radiation. So repeat surgery should only be performed when acute pressure effects occur. And in patients not previously treated with radiotherapy, radiation is an option. And in case of predominantly cystic recurrence, we can try aspiration of the cystic content or intracystic radiation by yttrium or other agents, and application of interferon alpha or bleomycin, and salvage surgery in case of life-threatening patients, and radiosurgery are the options in case of recurrent craniopharyngioma. So even after we treat these patients with surgery and radiotherapy, these patients have high chances of recurrence, as we see in the previous slide. And there are also these patients have long-term morbidity. These patients can have various problems in the various areas, like the patient have endocrine dysfunction. Even before the treatment, these patients can have these various endocrine deficiencies. And after treatment, also there is we have to supplement with the various hormones and other endocrine support. And there can also be visual and neurological problems, hypothalamic dysfunction, especially obesity and behavioral problems. And physical activity, there is a decrease in the physical activity and energy expenditure. There is autonomous nervous system dysfunctions, appetite regulation, and hypothalamic obesity. There is a decrease in the quality of life, neurocognitive outcome, and psychosocial functioning. This patient can also have a risk for developing cerebrovascular morbidity, and there is also a chance for second malignancy. So, coming to endocrine dysfunctions is anterior pituitary dysfunction can be seen around 40 to 87% even before the surgery, before the management, and diabetes insipidus present in around 72%. This is because the endocrine dysfunction can be due to either to the tumor itself or due to the involvement of the hypothalamic pituitary axis after the treatment. And transient diabetes insipidus can seen in around 80 to 100% of the cases, and can be permanent DI can be present in around 40 to 93% of the cases. So the risk of new endocrine deficits appear to be lower after transcranial surgery compared to the transcranial approach, and the chances of recovery of the pre-existing pituitary dysfunctions are rare, and most of the time it reverses after the treatment. And partial or complete hyperpituitarism is seen in around 80% of the patients, and most of the patients require 2 or more hormones. So in children, there is growth hormone replacement doesn't increase any tumor recurrences. And these patients, because of there is increased hormonal deficiencies, these patients need lifelong surveillance. In coming childhood CP, the growth hormone deficiency at time of diagnosis around 20 to 26 to 75% of the patients, and impaired growth may be present even before the diagnosis, and after surgery can increase to 70 to 92% of the patients. And insulin and leptin are suspected to play a compensating role in this phenomenon. Some visual and neurological deficits can be present, especially if the tumor is present very close to the optic apparatus or if it's a pre-chiasmatic location. And the risk factors for this visual deficits are the presence of visual symptoms at the time of diagnosis. If you are giving very high radiation dose to this patient, and the tumor is located in the pre-chiasmatic area, and if there is severe pre-surgical visual deficits. Almost 50% of the patients can have visual complaints even before surgery. There are reports that there can be slight improvement in patients after this treatment. The neurological sequelae include hemiparesis, epilepsy, cranial nerve deficits, and cerebrovascular disease. Most of the time, these sequelae are usually transient, and the long-term neurological complications is present in around 8% of these cases. If it is a very large tumor, the prevalence can increase to 36%, and if you consider both visual and neurological sequelae, it comes around 30%. Then hypothalamic dysfunction is a common, even especially when the tumor is very large, or we have made surgery on this large tumor which has a grade 2 or the hypothalamic involvement. The important hypothalamic dysfunctions are the obesity, behavioral changes. There can be disturbances in the circadian rhythm, sleep irregularities, more daytime sleepiness, and imbalance in regulations of body temperature, thirst, heart rate, and or blood pressure. So the rate of hypothalamic dysfunction increases mostly after gross total resections. And tumor involvement of the third ventricle and obstructive hydrocephalus are suggestive findings that these patients can develop the hypothalamic dysfunction. So surgical removal of the tumor which are present beyond the mammillary body, that is posterior part of the hypothalamic engages hypothalamic structures and cause obesity. So just like the pre-operative imaging for the hypothalamic involvement, after the surgery, there's a grading of the involvement of the hypothalamic with the association with the development of obesity. This is classification by Bailey et al. In grade 0, there is no damage to the hypothalamic structures, and this is mainly in the infradiaphragmatic locations, and this is the tumor resection area. In these cases, there is no increase in the weight gain. In grade 1, there is abnormality of the floor of the third ventricle or a breach in the tuber synovium. In these cases, there is an increase in the weight gain. And in grade 2, almost complete deficiency of the floor of the third ventricle. In these cases, there is increased chances of getting obesity. So this is the grading of post-operative grading of hypothalamus involvement and its relation to obesity. So there are eating disorders and obesities are also a post-operative sequelae. The hypothalamic involvement of all the treatment-related hypothalamic damage. The most common presentation is hypothalamic obesity. In children, this weight gain can occur even before the diagnosis of this craniopharyngioma. Weight gain occurs even after the treatment. We have supplemented with the endocrine deficiencies. And rapid weight gain usually is seen in the first 6 to 12 months after the treatment, and increased risk of metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular disease, or including sudden death, are seen in patients with this obesity. So this is a 2 patients where with 2 different hypothalamic involvement and the postoperative sequelae. In this patient, there is a hypothalamus in the subdiaphragmatic area, which is also a small tumor, and the hypothalamus is relatively spared. And post-operatively, this patient has no obesity. But in this patient, there's a large tumor including the cellular and supracellular area involving the hypothalamic area, and this patient developed obesity, hypothalamic obesity syndrome. So the extent of the tumor and the size of the tumor can predict, as well as the hypothalamus involvement can predict the development of obesity. So a lot of treatment, including the lifestyle management, the various drugs like central stimulants and diazoxide metformin has been tried. Also, the surgical treatment for this obesity has also tried, but no generally accepted either pharmacology or bariatric therapy for hypothalamic obesity in childhood pharyngiomas has been shown to be effective in randomized studies. So physical activity in childhood pharyngiomas, there is marked decrease in the physical activity. It may be attributed to the visual and neurological compromise associated with this tumor, but they have also increased daytime sleepiness associated with the hypothalamic damage. These things can lead to the decreased physical activity. These daytime sleepiness and obesity are correlated with the low concentration of melatonin in these patients. And there has been a study that supplementation with 6 milligram of oral melatonin has shown some promising treatment of this daytime sleepiness. In polysomnogram shows that different sleep patterns are typical for hypersomnia and secondary narcolepsy. Frequent sleep onset, REM sleep onset in these type of patients. So central stimulating agents like methylphenidate, modafinil, and dextroamphetamine have shown some benefit in these cases. So there is also autonomic nervous system dysfunction as a sequelae of this tumor. There is impaired central sympathetic output. Also, there is hypothalamic dysfunction of vagal output is considered as a cause for obesity. So disinhibition of vagal output is causes increased beta cell stimulation and hyperinsulinism and can cause insulin resistance and severe obesity. And in these patients also there is a reduced urine concentration of catecholamine metabolites. And there is some behavioral problems and deteriorated cognitive functions are also seen in these types of patients. So quality of life is impaired in these kind of patients. This is affected can be due to both by the tumor as well as the treatment we given. So most common areas of difficulty are seen in the social and emotional functioning with patients rating psychosocial status lower than their physical health. And high rate of psychopathological symptoms like depression, withdrawal, and anxiety are common in these cases of tumor. In children, there is difficulty in learning, inability to control emotions, unsatisfactory peer relationship, physical appearance, and the body image distortions are seen in these patients. And long-term neurocognitive complications like cognitive problems, particularly affecting the executive functions, attention, episodic memory, and working memory, are seen in children. So cerebrovascular morbidity, so radiation-induced vasculopathies can be seen in patients with craniopharyngioma. So one syndrome seen is the Moya-Moya syndrome, or the puff-like seen in this kind of patients, which is a pre-runner of stroke, can be seen. So in patients who underwent a radical resection, there is fusiform dilatations of the carotid artery seen in the post-operative image. In cardiac structures, there is function, structure, or rhythm abnormalities can be seen in these patients, especially prolonged QT interval can be seen. So in cases of patients with obese patients and metabolic syndrome, they can also be seen, can see non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and liver cirrhosis has been reported in these kind of patients. So the chances of second malignancy in those patients received radiations. There is not much report of second malignancies, but 4 case reports are described the presence of in 2 cases of glioblastoma and 1 case with glioma with unspecified grade of malignancy, and posterior fossa meningioma is reported. So otherwise, the chances of second malignancies are reported rare. So due to these various post-operative sequelae in craniopharyngioma, depending on the location, we should go for the risk-adapted modalities of treatment algorithms. So in patients with unfavorable location of this craniopharyngioma, we should go with hypothalamic sparing surgery, based on the grading of hypothalamic tumor involvement in the preoperative MRI. And in cases of radiation therapy, we should go with the proton beam therapy, especially in patients, younger patients less than 5 years of age after limited hypothalamic sparing survey. So this can cause relief of intracranial pressure symptoms, reversal of visual symptoms, or restoration or substitution of pituitary hormone deficits, and prevention of tumor regrowth or progression, and minimizing acute and long-term morbidity and mortality. So coming to survival and mortality, so control of tumor growth and the disease or treatment-related complication determine the long prognosis. Overall mortality in craniopharyngioma is reported to be 25 times greater than that observed in the general population. And overall survival described in pediatric cohort ranges from around 80 to 85 to 96% at 5 years and 65 to 100% at 10 years and 62%. And several studies have shown that younger patients experience better survival than the adult patients. The role of gender as a prognostic factor is not established clearly in these cases. Some others have observed a higher mortality in female patients. And in some studies, it is shown that papillary type of craniopharyngiomas has better prognosis compared to the Adamantium type of craniopharyngioma. Tumor size is likely to be a prognostic factor, that increased survival in rates are seen in tumors and small tumors less than 3 centimeters. So this is the post-operative quality of life in children and adolescents with craniopharyngioma. This is the Craniopharyngium 2000 project. So this was the study that that discussed whether we have when we have to give the radiation after subtotal resection of the tumor. So there can be two options. Either after subtotal resection we can give immediately after the resection we can give radiation, or after we can follow up the patient, and when there is chances of recurrence we can give the radiations. So they randomized these two groups of patients, and they compared the quality of life, overall survival, and progression-free survival in these patients. And this is an interim report of this trial, and this conclusion that it is not possible to recommend the optimal time for radiotherapy after incomplete resection with regard to the quality of life. So there is no conclusion that we can whether we have to go for immediate radiotherapy or later radiotherapy. So the take-home messages are craniopharyngiomas are generally benign tumors, but their location, size, and tendency to infiltrate the adjacent cerebral structures make their management challenging. The best treatment for craniopharyngioma is that which leads to the least long-term morbidity. And surgery is always the first treatment of choice. If you favorably locating tumors, hypothalamus sparing surgery should be considered. And local irradiation of residual tumor is efficient in preventing tumor progression. And post-treatment follow-up should include neuroimaging with MRI, visual assessment, and monitoring of endocrine functions and metabolic status. And endocrine and metabolic alterations need to be treated adequately. And these craniopharyngioma should be due to these various long-term sequelae, endocrine dysfunctions, and other hypothalamic involvement, obesity. They should be considered as a chronic disease, and these patients should have a lifelong follow-up. And ideally, these patients should be managed in a higher center with multidisciplinary team approach. Thank you.
So, thank you, Dr. Riaz. That was a very extensive and nicely reviewed talk on craniopharyngioma, and we all enjoyed that. And you have almost covered everything from starting from the history, pathogenesis, pathology to the manifestation to treatment to outcomes. So, thank you again. So, any questions from the audience?
Riaz, actually, I went in between to take a call. It may appear a repetition if we have addressed the issue, but what I want to know from you, what's your take on the issue of growth hormone replacement in pediatric age group as well as in adult growth hormone deficiency in a patient who has suffered from craniopharyngioma and has been adequately treated?
So in patients with craniopharyngioma after treatment, after 6 months, we should evaluate for the growth hormone deficiency. If it is deficient, we can start growth hormone therapy in children as well as in adults. There has no the reports are not showing that there is increased chance of recurrence when we give growth hormone. So we can give.
I think in contrast to our previous belief that growth hormone cannot be given in any tumor and all, but here craniopharyngioma we can give it.
In
What about
craniopharyngium,
adult? What about sir asked about adult growth hormone deficiency also?
in craniopharyngium study, it is said that after 6 months, we can, if it is deficient, if it is proven deficient, we can start.
So the main thing is that the concern of recurrence is not there when it comes to craniopharyngioma.
Correct.
Maybe with other pituitary tumors, it's a little bit more gray, but I think if it is treated properly irradiated, proper resection,
With the
then
treatment also.
you
But if
can
it is if we give only partial resection and we are not giving radiotherapy, there are chances of recurrence. But if we give also radiotherapy along with support resection, we can after 6 months of after evaluating the axis, we can start growth hormone.
Thank you. I think another very common questions in DM it is asked, and it's a favorite question of Professor Bhansali, is that some of the conditions where growth happens without growth hormone, and in few patients of you can explain that better actually for the students DM training.
Yes, this craniopharyngioma patients may not always have short stature. If you look at it for various reasons. So this patient, especially if these patients has hypothalamic involvement, these patients have developed obesity. So in this obesity, there is insulin resistance and there is increased level of insulin can be seen in these patients. So this insulin can act on the IGF-1 receptor and can lead to the growth. So another, this is one postulation. Another postulation that there is due to the obesity, there is increased fat mass, there is also increased leptin. So this leptin can directly act on the bone and cause increased stature. So these are the two postulations for growth without growth hormone.
Correct. Very nicely explained. So that's it. Any other questions or comments from the DM trainees? So I think that's none. Nilanjan sir, any other thing you want to add?
No, I think that was a very extensive job done. Thanks, Riaz, for that. And I think over to Ajay for conclusion. And thank you, Sambit, and thank you, Riaz, for taking the time of your busy schedules. We are still very busy mentally, emotionally, and also physically, not with endocrine, probably with non-endocrine things, but then we have to pass through this. So thank you still for giving time in this very difficult situation. Over to Ajay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Sambit Das sir, and thank you, Dr. Riaz sir, for a wonderful, comprehensive, and informative talk on craniopharyngioma. I'm sure it will be of great help to all of us. And thanks to Endocrine Society of Bengal for organizing such a informative and useful webinar. Now, before we conclude, I would like to inform you all regarding the next 4E webinar, which is scheduled to be held on June 7. It will be from 8 to 9 p.m. and the topic would be evaluation of the diabetic foot. Speaker for this session would be Dr. Ashu Rastogi and the chairperson would be Professor S.K. Singh. I request you all to try and attend the next 4E webinar as well. And thank you all. Stay safe and good night.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Jaya. Good night.
Thank you.
Sandy.